This time we're going to go over examples where we're going to write the name of compounds, and this again is a mixture of ionic and covalent. So as we're looking at the first example, number 12, you've got K2CO3. So again, we need to figure out, is this ionic or is this covalent? As you do that, you're going to see that potassium is a metal. Remember, anytime you see a metal, it's automatically going to be ionic. So we're going to go ahead and indicate that this is ionic. The other thing you're going to notice is that CO3 is a polyatomic ion. Anytime you see a polyatomic ion, automatically ionic. So what we're going to do is we're going to name the cation. So that's potassium. Do we need a Roman numeral? The answer is no. We only use Roman numerals with transition metals or tin and lead. So no Roman numeral. Now we have a polyatomic ion, and we're going to just name it. So the name of that polyatomic ion is carbonate. Done. All right, number 13. I did forget to indicate that's ionic. All right, we got Rb2s. All right, so as I'm looking at this example, I need to figure out if these are metals or nonmetals. Rubidium is an alkali metal, so I know automatically that it's ionic. I know that I'm going to name the cation first and the anion second with an IDE suffix. So I'm going to have rubidium. All right, rubidium is an alkali metal. It's not a transition metal, so no Roman numeral. All right, now I'm going to name the anion with an IDE suffix. So that's sulfide. All right, number 14, CaF2. All right, is this ionic or covalent? We're going to look up those elements on the periodic table. Calcium is an alkaline earth metal, so it's definitely going to be ionic. We're going to name the cation first, name the anion second with an IDE suffix. So calcium, again, not a transition metal, so no Roman numeral. Fluoride, because we got to put an IDE suffix on that anion. All right, number 15, SF6. What types of elements are these? We're going to look them up. Sulfur is a nonmetal. Fluorine is a nonmetal. Anytime you have nonmetals, it's going to be covalent. So how do I do this? Well, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to always use prefixes, unless mono would be on the first element. That's the only time that you don't. So let's look at sulfur. Sulfur does have a subscript of 1, but I will not use mono because that would be on the first element. So I'm simply going to write down sulfur. All right, now we've got F6. All right, so the prefix for 6 is hexa. And don't forget, you got to put an IDE suffix on that second element. So we're going to do hexafluoride. Number 16, PCl5. We're going to have to look at what types of elements we have. So we've got phosphorus, nonmetal. Chlorine, nonmetal. Anytime you have nonmetals, it's going to be together, it's going to be covalent. So this is going to be covalent. Again, I'm always going to use prefixes, but never put mono on the first element. So because there is a subscript of 1 here, I will not put mono because mono can only go on the second element, not the first. So I'm going to have phosphorus. All right, the subscript of 5 is penta, so I'm going to have penta. Now I'm going to name the second element with an IDE suffix, chloride. Let's go to number 17. We need to look up the types of elements we have. Ag is silver. Silver is a metal, so because we have a metal, I automatically know it's going to be ionic. Now, one of the things about silver is that it is a transition metal, so I'm going to need to use a Roman numeral. To figure out the Roman numeral we should use, we're going to have to uncross the charges. So as I do that, remember that there are subscripts of 1 here. They're just not written. So as I uncross the charge, silver is going to have a charge of +1. Let's double check chlorine's charge, make sure it's accurate, and it is. Chlorine does have a -1 charge, so I do know that there's nothing funky going on here. So I'm going to have silver. I'm going to put a Roman numeral 1. Remember, Roman numerals are required. They're never understood. They have to always be expressed. And then I have chloride. All right, next, NaNO3. You need to look up the types of elements. Na, sodium, is an alkali metal. So because it's a metal, it's ionic. The other indicator is that NO3 is a polyatomic ion. So we're going to name the cation, sodium. We do not use a Roman numeral because sodium is not a transition metal. Then we're going to name the polyatomic ion, nitrate. All right, let's go to number 19. Number 19, I do see that nitrogen, hydrogen, phosphorus, and oxygen are all nonmetals. However, one of the interesting things about these nonmetals is that they are all polyatomic ions. So I've got 1 polyatomic here, That's ammonium. So I'm going to name that polyatomic ion ammonium. And I'm going to see another polyatomic ion, phosphate. So we're simply going to name those cations and anions because this is an ionic compound. Let's go to number 20. Number 20, AlF3. So we need to look at the types of elements that we have here. All right, aluminum is a metal. So one of the things I'm going to do is once I notice it's a metal, it's ionic. For whatever reason, students always think that aluminum is a transition metal. It is not. It is not in the middle section of the periodic table. So please do not use a Roman numeral. It's not a transition metal. Simply going to name the cation, aluminum, name the anion with an ID suffix, fluoride. Number 21, let's look at the types of elements. Nitrogen's a nonmetal. Oxygen is a nonmetal. I've got two nonmetals. Anytime you have nonmetals, it's covalent. So remember, we're going to use prefixes unless mono would be on the first element. So we theoretically would need mono in the first, but we're not going to do that because we don't use mono in the first element. So nitrogen. Now, can I use mono in the second element? All right. And so oxygen does have a subscript of 1, and it's fine to put mono in the second element. So we're going to have nitrogen monoxide. We don't want the two O's in the middle together for monooxide, so we just condense it to the one O. All right, now we've got Ti3P2. So let's look at the types of elements. Titanium is a metal. In fact, it's a transition metal. So I know it's ionic, and I am going to need to use a Roman numeral with that transition metal. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to uncross the charges. So the 2 belongs to the titanium. The 3 belongs to the phosphorus. So when I go ahead and I write the name, I'm going to have titanium. I'm going to have Roman numeral 2, because it is a transition metal. And now we need to name the anion with an IDE suffix, phosphide. Now the next two examples are a little tricky. All right, one of the things you're going to notice is that zinc is a transition metal. So that's pretty common. It's going to be ionic. Here's the interesting part. When you go to uncross the charges, you're like, there's nothing there. Isn't that understood to be a 1? Well, kind of, but there's something else going on. Oxygen is always a 2. It's always a negative 2. But what happened to this 2? It's not there. So that means this must be an empirical formula. So I have this empirical formula that got reduced by a factor of 2 because the subscript here went from a 2 down to a 1. So even though there is a 1 understood to be here, what I'm going to need to do is I'm going to need to take that subscript of 1 and I'm going to need to multiply it by the factor that it got reduced by. So the factor it got reduced by was a 2. So when I take that 1 and I increase it back by that factor, I get a 2. That's an equal sign. Sorry. Okay, so the 2 gets first crisscross. Zinc was a +2. So I'm going to have zinc, Roman numeral 2, oxide. So that was an empirical formula. All right, number 24 is a little tricky. Copper, transition metal. So it's ionic. But one of the things that you're going to notice is that as you try to uncross the charges here, it is not a 3 that you're going to uncross. That 3 belongs to the polyatomic ion carbonate. So because that 3 belongs to carbonate, it's not a charge. You can't uncross it. So you got to think about what's on the outside here. So the charge that got crossed is understood to be a 1. So as I uncross that charge, copper is a +1. Let's just check out the carbonate just to make sure it makes sense. So this 2, is that the charge of carbonate? Yep, it sure is. Carbonate's a -2. So no empirical formulas there. So let's go ahead and write the name. This is going to be copper, Roman numeral 1, carbonate. So those are tricky. Those are kind of some of the more difficult problems we'll see.